HarperCollins presents The Mothers of Quality Street by Penny Thorpe. Read by Sherry Baines. Chapter 1. The toffees for the window display had been carefully painted with strong poison. Mr. Kirby, the shop owner, didn't like to spoil good food like this because it was such a shameful waste. But in the early summer heat of that coronation year of 1937, it had been the only way to keep the ants at bay. Besides, the salesman from Mackintosh's had been very clear when he gave that particular box of toffees to Mr. Kirby that they were inedible anyway. It was a relief to finally be throwing the casket away, because the worry of having poisoned goods on the premises had weighed on his mind. He'd warned his staff about them, and he was confident that none of them would forget and help themselves. But it had preyed on his thoughts as often as his wife had nagged him to throw them out. As Mr. Kirby stood in the hot shop window, dismantling his display, mopping perspiration from his brow and his hands, he took another look at the casket of sweets and thought again how proud he was of his work. He was not as much of an artist as the confectioner at the Mackintosh Factory, who had made the pretty sweets inside the silk-covered box with its golden trim. But he'd painted the toffee fingers so delicately with a gloss of liquid cyanide syrup that in the strong summer light the difference was barely noticeable. Mr. Kirby had, in fact, used rat poison. There was no sense going out and buying weak ant poison when he had enough Victorian rat poison in the cellar to kill an army. His wife was always telling him to get rid of the nasty stuff. It worried her, having it lying about the place. But Mr. Kirby pointed out in return that you couldn't get rat poison like that anymore. His mother used to put it down in the shop, and once they got rid of it, they'd never be able to buy any more. Only the other day, there'd been a story in the newspapers about how the government were making a new law to restrict the use of it, after an accidental poisoning down south somewhere. It was only a matter of time, Mr. Kirby told his staff, before they outlawed flypaper and made you surrender your mousetraps. Kirby's Fancy Goods was very close to the Halifax Borough Market, and they'd always attracted more than their fair share of mice, despite being a very clean, high-class establishment. The laying down of poison was a routine he'd inherited from his mother and her father before her, just as he'd inherited the shop. And although it was commonplace, on that occasion Mr. Kirby had been more cautious than usual, gathering all his staff and explaining to them personally that they were not to touch the new window display because he'd added poison to the centrepiece to keep off the ants, and that when it was dismantled, the casket was to go straight into the rubbish bin. Mr. Kirby and his wife had invested a lot of money in this window display, but it had been worth it. The coronation of the new king and queen had brought brisk business, with all the neighbourhood coming in to buy bright bunting and party goods for their street parties. Yes, the spring of 1937 had been a boon for Kirby's Fancy Goods. The window display had been done up in red crepe paper and golden curtain cord to look like an enormous royal crown, and lengths of blue satin ribbon with "God Save the King" on them crisscrossed a screen behind it. Mrs. Kirby had overcrowded the window with examples of every line they stocked that could possibly be connected with street parties, patriotism, or His Majesty the King. Coloured card hats in the shape of coronets, pop-up theatres for kiddies illustrating the inside of the Abbey, special coronation editions of magazines, knitting and sewing patterns for items of patriotic apparel, even a bouquet of carnations, artificially coloured to a burst of red, white and blue. Finally, nestled in the bottom right-hand corner on a velvet cushion, was the presentation casket of Mackintosh's Fancy Bonbons. They were not one of the shop's usual lines, but oh, how wonderfully royal they made the window look. They were like a treasure chest or a jewellery box, sparkling in the late May sun. Mr. Kirby often left open tins of toffees in his window, and had never had cause to poison them before, but the sweets in the opened tins were usually safe.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?